Pay attention to the lead soldier approaching the church. His name is Ramsey. He just ignited the wooden door with his fellow soldiers, laughing mockingly. Then sudden wind extinguishes flames completely, leaving him kneeling.
My name is Ramzi. I'm 34 years old, and on December 19th, 2007, I was an Iraqi soldier who hated Christians with every fiber of my being. I served in Baghdad, convinced I was defending my faith. That day changed everything I thought I knew about God and myself. I grew up in a Baghdad that was bleeding. The American invasion of 2003 had torn apart everything I knew as a child, and by the time I was old enough to hold out a rifle, hatred had become as natural to me as breathing. My father died in the early days of the chaos, caught in crossfire between insurgents and coalition forces. My mother, Allah rest her soul, raised me and my three sisters alone in a neighborhood where gunfire was our lullaby and the smell of smoke our morning air. The military became my salvation, or so I thought. At 19, I enlisted because it meant steady pay, 3 meals a day, and most importantly, it gave meaning to the rage that had been building inside me since childhood. I wasn't just another angry, young man with a gun. I was a soldier of Iraq, a defender of my people, a warrior for Allah. The recruiting officer looked me in the eyes and told me I would be fighting for something greater than myself. I believed every word. My unit became my family. There was Sergeant Malik, a man 10 years my senior, who had fought in the Iran-Iraq war and spoke of enemies with the coldness of someone who had seen too much death. He taught me that mercy was weakness, that our survival depended on our willingness to be harder than those who would destroy us. Then there were my closest brothers, Hassan and Omar, both from my neighborhood, both carrying their own scars from the years of violence. We shared everything together, our rations, our fears, our dreams of an Iraq free from foreign influence, but it was the hatred that truly bonded us. Not just hatred for the American soldiers or the insurgents who planted roadside bombs. No, our deepest contempt was reserved for the Iraqi Christians. They were the traitors in our midst, the ones who had welcomed the invaders, who had collaborated with the very forces that had destroyed our country. At least that's what we told ourselves. At least that's what made sense of the senseless world we were living in. I remember the first time I saw a Christian family fleeing their home. It was 2005, and sectarian violence was tearing Baghdad apart. This family, a father, mother, and two small children, were loading their possessions into an old car. The father kept looking over his shoulder, fear written across his face. I was on patrol with my unit, and Hassan spit on the ground as we passed them. That's when Sergeant Malik pulled us aside and explained what he called the truth about Christians in Iraq. He told us they were fifth columnists, secret agents who passed information to our enemies. He said they hated Islam and wanted to see it destroyed. He pointed to their churches and said those buildings were really meeting places where they planned attacks against good Muslims. I absorbed every word like a sponge soaking up poison. You have to understand, I was barely 20 years old and had never actually spoken to a Christian. Everything I knew about them came from the men I respected most, the soldiers who had kept me alive in firefights, who had shared their last cigarettes with me, who had carried my wounded body to safety when shrapnel tore through my leg during a mortar attack in Sadr City. These men were my heroes, my teachers, my brothers. When they told me Christians were the enemy, I believed them completely. The hatred grew stronger with each passing month. Every time a bomb exploded near a mosque, we blamed Christian conspirators. Every time coalition forces raided a Sunni neighborhood, we imagined Christian informants had guided them there. Every time we lost a brother in combat, we convinced ourselves that Christian treachery was somehow involved. It became easier to hate them than to face the complex reality of a war that made no sense, where the enemy could be anyone and trust could get you killed. By 27, I was a different man than the frightened teenager who had first put on a uniform. 4 years of war had carved away everything soft in me, everything gentle, everything that might have once felt compassion for fellow human beings. I had seen my best friend die from a sniper's bullet. I had pulled the burned bodies of civilians from car bomb wreckage. I had done things in the name of duty that still visit me in my dreams. The man who emerged from those experiences was hard as Damascus steel and twice as sharp. My unit specialized in what command called community stabilization operations. In plain language, we were the enforcers. When the neighborhood was causing problems, we were the ones sent in to restore order. We were good at our job because we had stopped seeing certain people as fully human. Christians, Kurds, Shia Muslims in Sunni areas, Sunni Muslims in Shia areas. They were all potential threats to be managed, controlled, or eliminated. The orders came down on a Tuesday morning in December. A Christian neighborhood in eastern Baghdad had been harboring what intelligence called terrorist sympathizers. There had been reports of weapons caches, secret meetings, and coordination with insurgent groups. Whether any of this was true didn't matter to us. What mattered was that we had been given permission to do what we had always wanted to do. I remember cleaning my rifle that morning with special care, the way my father had taught me to maintain his old hunting gun when I was a boy. Hassan and Omar were equally methodical in their preparations. We weren't just getting ready for another patrol. We were preparing for something that felt like justice, like finally striking back at the people we held responsible for our country's suffering. The anticipation was electric among the three of us, a shared excitement that we were finally going to make the Christians pay for their betrayal. That Tuesday evening, as we loaded our equipment and checked our ammunition, I felt more purpose than I had experienced in months. Tomorrow, we would show these Christian dogs what happened to traitors in our Iraq. The morning of December 19th dawned crisp and clear, with that particular quality of winter light that makes everything appear sharper, more defined. I woke before the call to prayer, my body already tense with anticipation for what lay ahead. Hassan and Omar were already awake when I rolled out of my bunk, both of them checking their gear with the same careful attention I had seen them give to preparing for the most dangerous missions. But this felt different. This felt personal. Sergeant Malik briefed us over strong tea and flatbread in the mess hall. The target was a small Christian community that had grown too comfortable, too visible in their faith. Intelligence reports suggested they were meeting regularly, possibly passing information to insurgent groups, definitely causing what he called destabilization in the area. The specific target was their church, a modest stone building that served as the heart of their community. Our mission was simple: send a message that would scatter them like leaves in the wind. I volunteered immediately to carry the torch. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of us. Fire had always been the great purifier, the force that separated clean from unclean, righteous from corrupt. When I wrapped my fingers around that wooden handle, soaked in diesel fuel and wrapped with cloth. I felt like I was holding justice itself. Hassan nodded approvingly, and Omar actually smiled, a rare expression on his usually serious face. We loaded into our petrol vehicle just after noon, the three of us riding in the back while our driver, a quiet man named Yusuf, navigated the scarred streets of Baghdad. I watched the familiar landscape roll past the bulletproof windows. Bombed out buildings stood like broken teeth against the sky. Children played in rubble strewn lots, their games a strange mixture of innocence and the violence they had grown up surrounded by. This was our Iraq, the Iraq we were fighting to preserve and protect. The Christian neighborhood was different from ours in ways both subtle and obvious. The buildings were better maintained, paint less faded, windows more often intact. There were fewer security barriers, fewer armed guards visible on the streets. To my eyes, this prosperity felt like proof of their collaboration. How else could they maintain such comfort in a city where most of us struggled just to survive? Their safety was evidence of their betrayal, their clean walls a testament to the blood money they had earned by selling out their fellow Iraqis. As we approached the church, my heart began beating faster. The building itself was smaller than I had imagined, built from honey-colored stone that caught the afternoon sunlight beautifully. A simple wooden cross rose from the roof, and though I had seen such symbols before, this one seemed to mock everything I believed in. Here was the enemy's banner, flying openly in the heart of Muslim Iraq, a constant reminder of foreign influence and religious contamination. Hassan was the first to speak as we parked across the street from the church. He pointed at the cross and made a joke about using it for target practice. Omar laughed and added his own crude comment about what we should do with the building after we finished with it. Their words felt like permission, like official authorization for the hatred that had been building inside me for years. We weren't just three soldiers about to commit an act of destruction, we were instruments of divine justice, agents of righteous anger. I stepped out of the vehicle first, the torch heavy in my hand but feeling perfectly balanced, like it belonged there. The street was mostly empty, which was exactly what we had hoped for. This needed to be a public demonstration, but not so public that we would face immediate retaliation. We wanted the Christians to find the charred remains of their holy place and understand the message. We wanted them to pack their belongings and leave Baghdad forever. The wooden door of the church was old but solid, carved with simple patterns that spoke of craftsmanship and care. For a moment, I found myself admiring the work, the way the wood grain caught the light, the precision of the joinery. Then Hassan made another joke about burning Christian craftsmanship, and the moment of appreciation vanished, replaced by renewed determination to complete our mission. As I approached the building's torch held high, I could smell the diesel fuel soaking through the cloth. The odor was sharp and chemical, cutting through the afternoon air like a promise of destruction. Hassan and Omar flanked me, their presence giving me strength and confidence. We had done dangerous things together before, but this felt different. This felt like the culmination of everything we had been building toward since the day we first put on uniforms. I touched the flame to the wooden door frame, and the fire caught immediately. The dried wood accepted the flame hungrily, and within seconds, bright orange tongues were licking up the sides of the entrance. The heat hit my face, warm and oddly comforting, like sitting too close to a cooking fire. Hassan and Omar cheered, their voices echoing off the empty street, and I felt a surge of satisfaction that was almost physical in its intensity. We stepped back to admire our work, watching as the flames spread up the doorway and began to catch on the window frames. The fire was beautiful in its way, hypnotic and pure, consuming the symbols of foreign faith with what felt like divine approval. I remember thinking that this was what victory looked like, what justice felt like when it finally arrived. The three of us stood there, laughing, making jokes about Christian, prayers going unanswered, about their God being powerless to protect his own house. We imagined the faces of the believers when they discovered what had happened to their precious church. We pictured them packing their belongings and fleeing Baghdad, finally understanding that they were not welcome in our city, our country, our world. That laughter felt good. It felt right. It felt like the most honest expression of everything I had believed and felt for the past 4 years of war and suffering. Then the wind came. The wind came from nowhere. I need you to understand something about that December afternoon in Baghdad. The day had been perfectly still, the kind of windless winter day where smoke rises straight up like a prayer and dust settles undisturbed on every surface. We had been standing there for maybe 30 seconds, watching our fire spread up the wooden doorframe, when suddenly the air around us began to move. It wasn't a gentle breeze or even a strong gust. This was something else entirely. The wind hit that burning doorway with the force of a deliberate hand, as if the very atmosphere had turned against our flames. I watched in stunned silence as the fire that had been climbing eagerly toward the roof suddenly flickered, wavered, and died, not just dimmed or reduced, but completely extinguished in the space of 3 heartbeats. Hassan stopped laughing first. I heard his voice cut off mid sentence, and when I turned to look at him, his face had gone pale beneath his dark skin. Omar was staring at the church entrance with his mouth hanging open, pointing at the now cold doorframe where our fire had been burning so confidently just moments before. The diesel soaked cloth that should have burned for at least 10 minutes was completely out, not even smoldering. That's when I felt it, the presence. I've tried to explain this moment to people over the years, and I always fall short of capturing what actually happened. It wasn't like seeing something or hearing a voice. Either it was more fundamental than that, more primal. Suddenly, standing there in that empty street with my torch in my hand, I became aware that I was not alone. Someone else was there with us. Someone whose attention was focused directly on me with an intensity that made my knees weak. My hands started shaking first. The torch, which had felt so natural and right in my grip just moments before, suddenly became impossibly heavy. I looked down at my fingers wrapped around the wooden handle and watched them tremble uncontrollably, as if my own body was rebelling against what I had just attempted to do. The shaking spread up my arms, through my shoulders, until my entire torso was vibrating like a tuning fork. The fear that hit me next wasn't the familiar fear of combat or danger. This was something deeper, more absolute. It was the fear of a child who has been caught in a terrible lie by someone who loves them too much to let them continue living in deception. It was the fear of standing naked before perfect truth after years of clothing myself in comfortable lies. But underneath the fear was something else, something that made no sense given what I had just been doing. Love. Overwhelming, inexplicable love washing over me like warm water. Not the conditional love I had known from family and friends. Love that depended on my behavior or my usefulness or my loyalty to the right causes. This was love that knew everything about me. Every cruel thought I had entertained, every act of violence I had committed, every moment of hatred I had nursed in my heart, and somehow continued to love me anyway. I dropped the torch. I didn't decide to drop it. My fingers simply opened against my wheel, and it clattered to the pavement at my feet. Hassan and Omar were talking to me, their voice seeming to come from very far away, but I couldn't focus on their words. All of my attention was consumed by the overwhelming certainty that Jesus Christ was standing right there, in front of me. I want to be very clear about something. I didn't see a figure in white robes. I didn't hear an audible voice speaking to me in Arabic or any other language. There were no angels singing or supernatural lights shining down from heaven. What happened was far more powerful than any of those things. I simply knew, with the same certainty that I knew my own name, that the man whose followers I had been persecuting was present with me in that moment. My legs gave out. I found myself on my knees in the dust of the street, and I couldn't have stood up if my life had depended on it. The weight of what I had just attempted to do crashed down on me all at once. I had tried to burn down the house of God. I had laughed while setting fire to a place where people came to worship the creator of the universe. I had been so proud of my hatred, so confident in my righteousness, and now I could see it all for what it really was. The tears came without any warning or permission from me. One moment I was a hardened soldier who hadn't cried since childhood, and the next I was sobbing like a broken child. But these weren't tears of sadness or defeat, they were tears of relief, the kind of crying that comes when a terrible weight you've been carrying finally gets lifted off your shoulders. Hassan and Omar were backing away from me. I could hear their boots scraping on the pavement as they moved toward the vehicle, their voices urgent and confused. They were asking what was wrong with me, whether I was sick, whether I had been hit by something they couldn't see. But I couldn't answer them because I was experiencing something that had no precedent in my life or my understanding. I was being forgiven, not just for the fire I had tried to set, but for everything. Every act of cruelty, every moment of hatred, every time I had chosen violence over mercy, darkness over light. The forgiveness wasn't something I earned or deserved or even asked for. It was simply being poured out over me like rain on parched ground. In that moment, kneeling in the dust outside the church I had just tried to burn, I understood that everything I thought I knew about God was wrong. Allah, as I had been taught to understand Him, was a God of judgment and wrath, demanding perfect obedience and punishing every failure with eternal fury. But this presence surrounding me was something entirely different. This was love that pursued enemies, grace that transformed hatred into worship, mercy that could reach even a heart as hardened as mine. I tried to speak, to form words that might express what was happening inside me, but all that came out was broken Arabic mixed with desperate attempts at prayer. I didn't know how to pray to Jesus. I had spent my entire life praying to Allah, following the forms and phrases I had memorized as a child. But now I was encountering someone completely different, and my old prayers felt like the wrong language entirely. The knowledge hit me like lightning, splitting open the night sky. Jesus was real, not just real as a historical figure or a prophet that other people believed in, but real in the way that the ground beneath my knees was real, in the way that my own heartbeat was real. He was there, present, alive, and everything I had been taught about him was a lie designed to keep me from this moment of recognition. I had grown up believing that Christians worshipped a dead man on a cross, that they had corrupted the message of a good teacher and turned him into some kind of false god. My Imam had taught me that Jesus was a prophet, yes, but only a man who had been elevated beyond his station by confused followers. The Quran itself spoke of Isa with respect, but made it clear that he was not divine, not the Son of God, certainly not God Himself. But kneeling there in the street, with tears streaming down my face and my whole body trembling, I knew with absolute certainty that every word I had been taught was wrong. This wasn't a dead prophet or a corrupted teacher or a false god created by human imagination. This was the living God, the creator of everything I could see and everything I couldn't see, and he had somehow become a man to reach people exactly like me. The weight of my sin became crushing in that moment, not just the fire I had tried to set, but the years of hatred I had cultivated like a garden. Every time I had looked at a Christian with contempt, every joke I had made about their faith, every moment I had felt satisfied by their suffering, every plan I had made to hurt them or drive them away, it all came flooding back to me at once, and I could see it the way Jesus saw it. I had been persecuting him. Every act of hatred toward his followers had been an attack on him personally. When I spat at the mention of Christian names, I was spitting at him. When I laughed at their fear as they fled their homes, I was laughing at his pain. When I planned to burn their church, I was planning to wound his heart. The realization was almost more than I could bear. But even as the weight of my guilt threatened to crush me completely, something else was happening. The same presence that was showing me the true horror of my actions was simultaneously communicating something that made no sense according to everything I had ever learned about justice or fairness or divine punishment. He was not angry with me. I know how that sounds. I know it seems impossible that someone could try to burn down God's house and find nothing but love waiting for them. But that's exactly what happened. Where I expected judgment, I found mercy. Where I deserved wrath, I encountered grace. Where I had earned condemnation, I was offered forgiveness. The Arabic words that came out of my mouth next surprised even me. Ya Isa, Ana Asif. Jesus, I am sorry. I had never called him by that name before, never acknowledged him as anything more than a historical figure that other people misunderstood. But in that moment, his name felt like the most natural thing in the world to say. And then, though I heard no audible voice, I understood his response as clearly as if he had spoken directly into my ear. I know, my son, I know you are sorry, and you are forgiven. The words hit me with such force that I collapsed forward, my forehead touching the dusty pavement. I wasn't worthy of forgiveness. I was a soldier who had spent years planning violence against his people. I had entered his neighborhood that very day with the intention of destroying something precious to him. I had no right to expect mercy, no claim to his grace. But that's what made it so powerful. This wasn't forgiveness that I had earned through good behavior or religious observance. This wasn't mercy that I could claim because I had been sincere in my mistaken beliefs. This was pure grace, undeserved and unearned, flowing toward me simply because he chose to give it. I began to pray in a way I had never prayed before. Not the formal prayers I had memorized as a child, not the ritualistic phrases that had become automatic after years of repetition. These were broken, desperate words coming from the deepest part of my heart. I told him I was sorry. I told him I had been wrong about everything. I told him I didn't deserve forgiveness, but I desperately needed it. And in response, I felt him beginning to change me from the inside out. The hatred that had been my constant companion for 4 years of war began to drain away like poison being drawn from a wound. In its place, something clean and new was flowing in. Not just the absence of hatred, but its opposite. Love for the very people I had been planning to hurt. Concern for the Christians whose church I had tried to burn. Genuine sorrow for the pain my people had caused them. I thought about the Christian families I had seen fleeing Baghdad over the years. For the first time, instead of seeing them as traitors or enemies, I saw them as Jesus saw them, frightened people trying to protect their children, faithful believers being driven from their homes for no crime other than following the truth, human beings created in the image of God, deserving of protection rather than persecution. The change was so dramatic, so complete that it frightened me. This wasn't a gradual shift in perspective or a slow evolution of my thinking. This was an instantaneous transformation, as if the man who had lit that torch no longer existed, and someone entirely new had taken his place. I was still Ramzi, still an Iraqi soldier, still kneeling in the street outside the church in Baghdad, but everything essential about who I was had changed. Hassan and Omar were calling to me from near the vehicle. I could hear the confusion and concern in their voices, but I couldn't respond to them yet. I was too overwhelmed by what was happening inside me to stand by the complete reversal of everything I had believed about God and truth and myself. Have you ever experienced a moment when everything you thought you knew turned out to be wrong? When the foundation of your entire worldview cracked and crumbled, leaving you standing in the ruins of your former certainties? That's what was happening to me. But instead of feeling lost or afraid, I felt more found than I had ever been in my life. Jesus Christ was real, and he had just reached down into the heart of his enemy and made him into a son. Getting up from my knees felt like learning to walk again. Hassan and Omar were staring at me like I had lost my mind, and maybe from their perspective, I had. The man they knew, the soldier who had volunteered to carry the torch, who had been eager to burn down a church just minutes before, was gone. In his place stood someone they couldn't recognize, someone whose eyes were red from tears and whose hands were still shaking from an encounter they couldn't understand. Ramzi, what happened to you? Hassan demanded, his voice sharp with confusion and growing anger. Why did you drop the torch? Why are you crying like a woman? I tried to explain, but the words that came out of my mouth sounded insane, even to me. How do you tell your fellow soldiers that you've just met Jesus Christ? How do you explain to men who share your hatred for Christians that you've suddenly been filled with love for them? I stumbled through broken sentences about the wind, about feeling something, about knowing that what we were doing was wrong. Omar grabbed my arm, roughly, pulling me toward the vehicle. You're having some kind of breakdown, he said. We need to get you back to base, get you checked by the medic. But I couldn't leave yet. I turned back toward the church. toward the doorframe that should have been consumed by flames, but was now completely undamaged except for some black soot marks. The building looked different to me now, not like an enemy stronghold or a symbol of foreign influence, but like a house of prayer, a place where people came to worship the same God who had just transformed my heart. The ride back to base was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Hassan and Omar whispered to each other in the front seat, occasionally glancing back at me with expressions that mixed concern with disgust. They thought I had suffered some kind of mental break, and from their perspective, that was the only logical explanation for what they had witnessed. Soldiers don't suddenly start crying and refuse to complete their missions. Muslims don't show up at Christian churches and start praying to Jesus. When we arrived at the compound, Hassan immediately went to find Sergeant Malik, while Omar stayed with me, clearly under orders not to let me out of his sight. I sat on my bunk in our shared barracks, still trying to process what had happened, still feeling the aftershocks of the spiritual earthquake that had just reshaped my entire existence. Sergeant Malik arrived within the hour, his face dark with the anger and confusion. He dismissed Omar and sat down across from me, his eyes boring into mine with intensity of someone trying to diagnose a dangerous malfunction. Explain to me what happened out there, he said, his voice deadly quiet. I told him the truth. I told him about the wind that extinguished our fire, about the overwhelming presence I had felt, about knowing with complete certainty that Jesus Christ was real and that everything we had been doing was wrong. I watched his expression change from confusion to disbelief to fury as I spoke. You're telling me, he said slowly, that you abandoned a direct military operation because you think you had some kind of religious vision. You're telling me that you've converted to Christianity? The word hung in the air between us like a live grenade. Christianity. I hadn't even thought of it in those terms yet, but I realized he was right. That's exactly what had happened. I had become a Christian in the space of a few minutes, kneeling in the dust outside a church in Baghdad. Yes, sir, said quietly. That's exactly what I'm telling you. What followed was the most terrifying 2 hours of my military career. Sergeant Malik brought in the base commander, who brought in the intelligence officer, who brought in the chaplain. They interrogated me like I was a suspected traitor, trying to determine whether I had been compromised by enemy agents or was simply suffering from combat stress. The idea that I might have had a genuine religious experience never seriously entered their consideration. The commander's verdict was swift and harsh. I was to be confined to quarters pending a full psychiatric evaluation. My weapons were confiscated, my security clearance suspended, my access to sensitive information revoked. Within hours, word had spread throughout the base that Ramzi had suffered a mental breakdown and was claiming to have converted to Christianity. The reactions from my fellow soldiers ranged from pity to outright hostility. Some of them thought I was faking a psychological condition to get discharged from active duty. Others believed I really had lost my mind and treated me like a dangerous lunatic. A few, the most devout Muslims among them, looked at me with the kind of disgust usually reserved for traitors and apostates. But the worst part was the isolation. These men had been my family for 4 years. We had shared everything together, our food, our fears, our dreams for the future. We had saved each other's lives in combat, mourned our fallen brothers together, celebrated our victories side by side. Now, suddenly, I was an outsider among them, contaminated by association with the enemy faith. The psychiatric evaluation took 3 days. The doctor was a kind man who seemed genuinely concerned about my well being, but he approached my experience through the lens of medical science and military psychology. To him, religious visions were symptoms of stress induced psychosis or elaborate defense mechanisms against combat trauma. The idea that I might have actually encountered the divine never appeared in his diagnostic manual. During those 3 days of confinement, I had nothing to do but think and pray. I prayed to Jesus constantly, not because anyone had taught me how, but because talking to him felt as natural as breathing. I told him about my confusion, my fear of what was happening to me, my sorrow for the years I had spent hating his people, and somehow, despite the chaos around me, I felt his peace settling over me like a blanket. The most difficult moment came when they brought my mother to the base. Someone had contacted her, told her that her son was having psychological problems and claiming to have converted to Christianity. I watched the horror spread across her face as the doctor explained my condition to her in clinical terms. To her, mental illness would have been preferable to apostasy. Ramsey, she said when we were finally alone together, her voice breaking with grief, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you haven't abandoned your faith, haven't betrayed everything your father died for. Looking into my mother's eyes, seeing the genuine anguish there, was harder than facing enemy fire. This woman had sacrificed everything to raise me and my sisters after my father's death. She had worked multiple jobs, gone without food herself to make sure we ate, prayed 5 times a day for our safety and success, and now, in her mind, her only son had thrown it all away for the religion of our oppressors. Mama, I said gently, I haven't abandoned faith. I've found it for the first time in my life. The discharge papers came through 2 weeks later. Mentally unfit for military service, they read. The Army psychiatrist had concluded that I was suffering from a severe stress reaction that had manifested as religious delusions. They gave me an honorable discharge, a small pension, and a recommendation for continued psychological treatment. What they couldn't give me back was my family, my community, or my place in the world I had known. My mother refused to see me after that conversation at the base. When I returned to our family home, I found my belongings packed in boxes by the front door. My sisters crossed to the other side of the street when they saw me coming. The neighborhood mosque where I had prayed since childhood banned me from entering. Within a month, I had become a ghost in my own life, invisible to everyone who had once mattered to me. But something extraordinary was happening in the midst of this rejection. The very people I had tried to hurt were reaching out to me with open arms. Word had somehow spread through Baghdad's small Christian community that a Muslim soldier had tried to burn their church and ended up converting to Christianity. Instead of celebrating my downfall or seeking revenge, they began seeking me out. The first was an elderly man named Father Yusuf, a priest who had served the Christian community in Baghdad for over 30 years. He found me sitting alone in a tea house near my old neighborhood, nursing a glass of lukewarm chai and trying to figure out what to do with my life. He simply sat down across from me and said, "You must be Ramzi. I've been praying for you." That conversation changed everything. Father Yusuf didn't treat me like a curiosity or a trophy convert. He spoke to me like a father speaking to a son who had been lost and was now found. He told me about Jesus, not as a theological concept, but as a living person who wanted a relationship with me. He explained that becoming a Christian wasn't about changing religions, but about coming home to the God who had created me. Through Father Yusuf, I was introduced to an underground network of Iraqi Christians who had been meeting in secret for years. These weren't the comfortable, prosperous collaborators I had imagined in my hatred. These were ordinary people who gathered in basements and hidden rooms, who shared their meager resources with anyone in need, who prayed for their persecutors by name every week. The first time I attended one of their meetings, I was overwhelmed by their response to me. Here was a man who had spent years planning violence against them, who had literally tried to burn down their church just weeks before. And they welcomed me like a brother returning from a long journey. They prayed for me, shared their food with me, and began teaching me about the faith I had stumbled into so suddenly. I learned to read the Bible in Arabic, studying the words of Jesus with the same intensity I had once devoted to military tactics. Every page revealed new depths to the love I had encountered that day outside the church. Jesus wasn't just forgiving and merciful, he was someone who actively sought out enemies and transformed them into family. He ate with tax collectors and sinners, touched lepers and outcasts, and died for the very people who were killing him. The parallels to my own story were impossible to ignore. I had been Jesus' enemy, actively persecuting his followers, planning to destroy his church. But instead of striking me down, he had reached into my heart and planted seeds of love where hatred had once grown. Instead of punishing me for my crimes, he had adopted me as his son. As months passed, I began to understand that my conversion was just the beginning. God had a purpose for my life that went beyond my personal salvation. Having been transformed from persecutor to believer, I had a unique calling to reach other Muslims with the love of Christ, not through force or manipulation, but through the same radical love that had conquered my own heart. I started sharing my testimony wherever I could find people willing to listen. In tea houses and market squares, in private homes and secret meetings, I told the story of what had happened to me outside that church. The reactions were always mixed. Some people thought I was mentally ill. Others accused me of being a foreign agent. But a precious few, heard something in my words that resonated with their own spiritual hunger. The death threats started about 6 months after my conversion. Anonymous notes slipped under my door, warning me to stop spreading Christian lies or face the consequences. My landlord evicted me after receiving pressure from neighbors. Job opportunities dried up as word spread about my apostasy. By the end of my first year as a Christian, I was essentially living as a refugee in my own country. But I had also discovered something that no threat could take away from me. I had found my true identity, not as an Iraqi soldier or a Muslim or a member of any earthly tribe, but as a beloved son of the Most High God. That identity was unshakable because it didn't depend on human approval or social acceptance. It was rooted in an unchanging love that had already proven itself stronger than my worst hatred. Today, 18 years after that December afternoon, I live in a different country, serving as a pastor to Iraqi refugees and asylum seekers. Many of them are Christians who fled the same persecution I once helped to create. Some are Muslims who have never heard the gospel presented with love instead of judgment. All of them are precious to the God who transformed my life, the church I tried to burn still stands. I know because I visit it whenever I return to Baghdad. The scorch marks on the doorframe have long since been painted over, but I can still see exactly where my torch touched the wood. I kneel in that same spot sometimes, overwhelmed by gratitude for a God whose love is stronger than human hatred. Look inside your own heart right now. What fires are burning there that only Jesus can extinguish? What hatred has taken root that only divine love can transform? I'm telling you this story not as someone who was always good, but as someone who was utterly lost until grace found him. The same Jesus who stopped me from burning his house wants to stop the destruction in your life too. He wants to transform your hatred into love, your darkness into light, your death into life. If God can change a soldier's heart bent on destruction, he can change yours too. That church still stands, and so does the offer of grace. The question is, will you let him extinguish the fires of anger and hatred in your own heart? Will you let Jesus transform you the way he transformed me?